Well, welcome everybody. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in Australia and pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and future. I'm Professor Shahram Akbarzadeh, convener of the Middle East Studies Forum at Deakin University in Australia. And I'm delighted to be hosting this panel with Professor Anoush Ehteshami. Professor Ehteshami, who you see on the screen, is the Nasser al-Sabah Chair and Director of His Highness Sheikh Nasser al-Sabah Research Program. He's also the Director of the Institute for Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at Durham University. We're very fortunate today to have a panel of experts to discuss the prospects of the Iran nuclear deal and what implications that would have for the Persian Gulf region. As you will know, the nuclear deal, affectionately known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPoA, was signed in 2015 between Iran and 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council plus Germany, and subjected Iran to an unprecedented inspection regime to limit and monitor Iran's nuclear program in return for sanctions relief. It was supposed to be President Obama's lasting legacy, but was soon dismantled by his successor, President Trump, who called it a very bad deal for the US, and instead adopted a policy of maximum pressure to bring Iran to its knees. Fast forward to President Biden, and we are now seeing attempts to revive the deal. But as we will explore in the course of this conversation today, the JCPoA is not without its detractors. There's a strong voice in the US domestic politics and also in the Gulf region that rejects the deal as a carte blanche for Iran to pursue its regional ambitions. Indeed, that's the kind of dissenting voices that have made the revival of the deal fraught with complications. And as we have followed the news, there are acts of sabotage against Iran's nuclear program and targeted assassination of nuclear scientists to derail the program and shut down doors of diplomacy. That's truly the stuff of James Bond movies. Now, to help us get our head around these complications and the implications of the deal for the region, we are joined with a panel of experts. And that's the order of our presentation today. Dr. Anicee Van Engeland is Associate Professor of International Security and Law at Cranfield University, UK. Dr. Mahjoob Zweiri is Associate Professor in Gulf Studies and Iran and the Director of Gulf Studies Centers at Qatar University. And Dr. Andreas Krieg, Assistant Professor at the School of Security Studies at King's College London, Royal College of Defence Studies, and Fellow at the Institute of Middle Eastern Studies. Our panel members will share their expertise for about 15 minutes each. Then we shall move on to my co-host, Professor Ehteshami, for his insights, and then Q&A. So please save all your questions to the last. Now, Anicee, if you don't mind, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I would like to thank you and thank Anoush for inviting me to be part of this panel alongside my esteemed colleagues. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. So I'm going to speak for 15 minutes about those drivers and obstacles, and what I don't raise, hopefully my colleagues will come in or we can raise them in the Q&A. So I will start with a statement that wasn't that obvious a couple of months ago, and that is that Iran is a regional power to be taken into account. And that's what I said in the UK report on Iran-UK relationship not so long ago in the United Kingdom. And it has become so since the Iraq invasion in 2003, but also Trump, when he walked away from the JCPoA and the sanctions, have actually contributed to strengthening Iran's position as a regional power. So basically, the discussion that we are looking at today around the JCPoA are more than about the JCPoA as a CBRN legal tool, so chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear treaties tool. It's also possibly one of the key to the peace in the Middle East. And this is definitely one of the drivers for a lot of the actors, including the United States. But it could also, if it were to go wrong, as Shahram was suggesting, because of Iranian ambitions, it could further provoke escalation in the region. So basically, the JCPoA is more than just a name, it's really a symbol. And what I will be talking about in the next 15 minutes is how it's become a symbol of opportunities, actually, for the region, but also for the world. So first of all, in terms of the JCPoA, when we speak about it, we need to question, first of all, what it will be in the future. What shape will it take if it's actually revived, if it carries on, if it's transformed? Will we come back to the Obama deal? That is not exactly what Biden was suggesting, perhaps. He spoke about the possibility of using it as a milestone for future negotiations, which of course then raised the issue of timing. As we all know, there are presidential elections coming next in Iran. Will the next team be willing to engage with future negotiation with the US? There are also Iran regional's ambition to be taken into account, which is that if we were to raise the issue of the missiles, or if we were to raise the issue of regional security, it is unlikely that the Iranians will carry on negotiating. Since, as I often speak, the Islamic Republic of Iran has basically created the buffer zone around Iran to protect the Islamic Republic. So a regional security policy to protect the Republic, and it's unlikely they will negotiate on this. There's also, of course, and I'm sure everyone will come back to this, the urgency, which is a driver for all actors in the region and internationally, which is that basically after May, June, we will be blind to what will be happening in Iran with regard to nuclear energy. And eventually there's the issue of legality. So I'm a lawyer, so obviously I'll bring in the law from time to time here. And the legality is the issue of compliance with the spirit of the JCPoA, because the Iranians so far have not violated legally the JCPoA, but have obviously endorsed another narrative, which has been that of compliance with the spirit. So the question will be, what would happen after if we do not go back to the Obama JCPoA, or if we do not manage to negotiate something similar along the line. So the question very much in terms of drivers and obstacles in the region and from a world perspective is, what is exactly the interest of all of the parties involved to carry on negotiating here? So for the United States, I'm going to outline some of them, which is perhaps the idea of bringing peace in the region at last. The world leader, I mean, President Biden has insisted very much on the US being back as a world leader. But also from an international law perspective, the JCPoA is extremely important. The CBRN world in international law is very special, which is that normally what we want is legal regulations on topics that will happen at the domestic level, the regional level, and the international level. When it comes to CBRN, so including the nuclear, this is a field of international law where we like to operate at the states level first, trickling down basically to the domestic level. So whatever will happen with the negotiation on the JCPoA will influence future nuclear negotiations around the world and the legitimacy, if you want, of all forms of treaties that would refer to CBRN, so everything that's chemical, radiological, and biological and nuclear. So, of course, the drivers for Iran is lifting the sanctions. I think we will all agree on this, but also possibly have its existence acknowledged, which raises a lot of question. What does that mean in terms of an Islamic Republic? It's not be seen as the enemy anymore. Or would that also mean the regional ambitions of Iran being acknowledged? With regard to the different countries in the region, whether you look at the Gulf or the Middle East, there are multiple drivers and obstacles. And I will focus on the drivers later. I'm just going to focus on the obstacles right now in the introduction, which is basically it is highly likely that a lot of the countries in the Gulf and surrounding Iran are not too keen on seeing an Iran already stronger than it is right now, and how it could impact the sectarian lines, the ethnic lines, the religious lines. So I'm thinking about the Iraqi militia in particular. Would they be keen to see a JCPoA agreement signed? Probably not. So also the case of Israel. Israel might fear to be a big loser here. And in the scenario that I will be looking at later, I'm still presenting actually Israel as perhaps a loser in all the negotiation. But first, please let me focus on the opportunities that the JCPoA could actually bring. Well, I think we will all agree here that there's an opportunity for a regional security framework. When Trump spoke about Arab NATO, he probably didn't realize that the moment for Arab was probably past, and that nothing could happen in the region without taking into account three regional powers, namely Israel, Iran, and Turkey. So that brings us back, of course, to Zarif's proposal at one stage in terms of working closer with Saudi Arabia. The interest here would be for especially Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey in terms of reimagining how regional security could look like. And that could also be at the advantage of the United States. With time, there will be economic growth, political growth. Some have also suggested that it could help resolving conflict. That would again depend on Iranian perspective on regional security. They are quite comfortable right now with that buffer zone that they've created around Iran to protect the Islamic Republic. Would they let go of this? I think we also need to look at the wider dynamic in the region. So how Iran is interacting with Qatar, the agreement with Azerbaijan, the push forward for more agreement with Russia. Of course, the sort of memorandum of understanding, although it's not even a memorandum of understanding with the Chinese, but the recent relationship with Turkey as well. And when I'm citing all those countries, you see that Saudi Arabia and Israel are not mentioned. So that actually raises a lot of question in terms of isolation and opportunities, and how having a dialogue between Saudi Arabia and Iran would probably be at the advantage of the whole region in terms of the Middle East and the Gulf region. So we could really transcend all the current fears that exist regionally by trying to foster a dialogue between Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. My next point is going to be perhaps a little bit more controversial: a nuclear Iran. Why not? So Rouhani declared in the last 24 hours that Iran could possibly actually get to the 90% that are needed to act militarily. But what Salehi, who is the chief of the nuclear, has said is that it will always be a peaceful use. And this is actually something that's often lost in the narrative that the Iranians have presented, is that there's wealth of fatwa in Iran about that make a distinction between producing nuclear energy, perhaps having the ability to enrich nuclear for military needs, versus using it militarily. And so there's including a fatwa from the current guide who explain that it's not because you actually act within the framework of Islam, which is that you are allowed to do deterrence, that you will actually act in a non-discriminatory fashion. So I explain that is Islamic legal terminology, which is that basically in Islamic law, and especially in Shia Islamic law, the use of nuclear weapons is prohibited because it targets people in an indiscriminate fashion. Anyone can be targeted anywhere, and that is actually illegal. And the Iranian authorities have endorsed that narrative of the use of nuclear militarily as being illegal, but not the production of it. And so when we look at the Iranian discourse today, it's very much in line with those fatwas. So if Iran were to use the nuclear power militarily, they would have to walk back on that narrative, and that will require another fatwa. Why would it require another fatwa? Because the Islamic Republic of Iran and the authorities have always used the law as a way to legitimize its narrative. And if it were to start not respecting the law, it could start to unravel the Islamic Republic from inside. Next, I'd like to look at the risk of what I've actually just suggested, because what I've just speaking about sounds very rosy in terms of trying to foster a dialogue between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but there are risks. And some of the risks to this regional framework is that in the region, we don't have democracies. I know that Israel likes to present itself as a democracy, but Israeli thinkers themselves have questioned this recently. So we have governance systems that are actually being fossilized, especially the Islamic Republic of Iran in their ways. They're not renewing themselves, and that has had a very heavy cost on human rights, and that's the case for several of the countries. So what we also saw is the impact of the pandemic that we need to take into account, that has had a heavy cost in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Also the impact of the sanctions in terms of suffocating the middle class in the Islamic Republic of Iran, and we know that the middle class is one of the drivers to have a democracy. So when we are actually encouraging a dialogue between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but also other countries in the region, we need to make sure that the emphasis remains on the vitality of the governance system so that they keep to being flexible, but also on human rights. Another element that needs to be taken into account as a risk is the isolation of Israel. Okay, because right now I'm very much focusing on an axis between Iran and Saudi Arabia and Turkey, and what would that mean for Israel? Okay, so that's another question that's open. Another question would be, what about the proxy wars that Iran has started throughout the region in terms of what about the militia? So sometimes we are under the impression that, for example, the Houthi in Yemen are not exactly responding very well to the Iranian authorities. We've also saw an increase of proxies, including in Iraq, so that raises the issue of control. So how would those militia would actually react to the JCPoA? Another risk to be taken into account is the role of international power. So when we speak about regional security, very often when I teach on this around the world, I have people who think that this is it, that the regional security element will mean that they won't have the influence from China and the United States anymore. Well, actually the dynamic in this very specific case of Iran would work better if the big powers are still playing a role. So that would be the question would be how the United States would still like to play a role in the Middle East and the Gulf. That would have changed. And the same for China, because right now their ambitions are being designed as imperialist power that actually like to control whatever is happening in the region. So that is very clear when Trump's used the policy of the maximum pressure, or when you read articles about colleagues who speak about Iran as a Cold War. Those are colonialist, imperialist perspective that demonstrate a complete lack of understanding of what the Islamic Republic of Iran is today, or what Saudi Arabia is today. There's also another element to be taken into account, is the appetite for international powers to really regulate what's happening in the Middle East. Whether you look at the United States or China, they have a lot of their hands right now at home, not only with the pandemic, but also in terms of human rights. It is not a secret that our democracies in Iran, in Australia, in Europe are really in a difficult time, especially when it comes to balance between human rights and security. And the question is, what is the appetite for external interference, intervention, contribution? That raises, of course, the issue of the role of China and Russia that are currently supporting the JCPoA. The drivers to them would, of course, be peace in the Middle East. But if we have the JCPoA in its shape or another shape, how would these international powers position themselves, basically? Okay, for Iran, it would probably be very interesting because it would be the opportunity to become a gateway, a sort of balancing weight between all those international powers, but how would they position themselves? Finally, and to conclude, there are factors that the Rouhani administration have to take into account right now that are pretty big. So first of all, there is something that has been published about the radicalization of Iranian politics recently. And that is illustrated with, for example, the Speaker of Parliament that forced a so-called bill, because it's not sure there was a bill that was passed in 2013 in Parliament, to basically go on enriching more in terms of the uranium, but also to limit the visit of UN inspectors in Iran. And the Speaker of Parliament has actually bypassed the president, as it is allowed under Article 1 of the Civil Code. And so this is an example of the radicalization that Rouhani and the next president will have to take into account. Another element to take into account that the Rouhani administration has to handle is, of course, the sanctions. If the sanctions are not lifted, there cannot be a negotiation. And I think that anyone who would be in that situation, as the Iranians are, would agree. Finally, there is, of course, the security penetration to be taken into account. The latest attack on Nantas actually demonstrate that the Islamic Republic is not as secure as it believes it is. So my conclusion on all of this is that it is definitely time for a change of perception of the role of Iran, but also a time for change about how regional powers interact with each other, taking into account the role and contribution of international powers. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anicee. You've raised a lot of important issues, but we are going to hold on to our questions until all speakers have finished. So we're going to move quickly to Mahjoob now. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Shahram Jan, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Anoush, also for the invitation. Few points, just would like to shed more light on them, so I can move on to the important question where I want to focus on Iran's Gulf Arab neighboring view on what's happening when it comes to the JCPoA. The question maybe we need to answer and maybe remind ourselves of why this deal was from the beginning, and why did Iran accept this deal? To me, there were three main reasons. One, it was an opportunity to renew the legitimacy of the regime. It's an international recognition of the nuclear program. It's a strong message to the neighboring countries that I am playing with the real players, with 5+1. So you cannot compete with me. It was obvious that Europeans and the United States in particular, they have a different perception of Iran, and they were willing to change their perception and to accommodate Iran. And I think Barack Obama personally and his team had very clear view that maybe the best approach to handle Iran is actually to include Iran, to engage with Iran and play with Iran as other players, rather than isolating Iran and radicalizing the system. So the deal was basically a golden opportunity to Iran, a golden opportunity to the Europeans and the United States to move on beyond what I call it very traditional perception and old politics of handling Iran. Move on to be more a little bit liberal, sporty, and move on and willing to change, willing to put different ideas, to think out of the box, and maybe far away from the box as well. Now the deal was signed. Everything was, shiny. There was, of course, there are some players were worried, especially the GCC countries. But at least the main players, they were looking at the future with a lot of hope. While they are just, celebrating, they wake up suddenly to the fact that there is something going on. There is change in the White House, and the new president came, and his main goal is to shut down this deal, basically. So American administration followed three patterns to tackle this. One, the maximum pressure. Second, the demonization efforts of Iran. I would say the increasing efforts of demonization of Iran, and opening up the strategy of targeting Iran. And here, I mean the cyber attacks. And it was clear that Trump had given to the Israelis what the Israelis wanted, especially Benjamin Netanyahu, is let me do it. If we don't want war, however, we can weaken the program by targeting it through cyber attacks. And those three also came to create a serious obstacles before the deal. This meant radicalization of politics in Iran, the whole issue of perception change has collapsed. Both sides they went back to their own position. They become more radical. Accusations, war of words every day. Bringing back all old files. Iran is destabilizing a region. Iran is supporting non-state actors. Is destabilizing the situation in Yemen and Iraq, and all of these stories, all the stories, I would say pre-2015, they came back again to the platform, to the media, and a serious war of words restarted between 5+1 and Iran. This wave of radicalization of politics in Iran was basically caused by the maximum pressure policy, because this pressure, this political and economic pressure, had put the government of Iran under severe pressure, and it basically failed to deliver to its own citizens when it comes to the economy and improving the economic life. It's important to remind that Rouhani put his huge investment in this deal because he was hoping that this deal will help him to change the whole economic platform in Iran and improve the people's life. Now with 2018 and pre-2018, I mean, with the victory of Trump and then with the official withdrawal from the deal, officially Iran, left alone, and they have to face two very severe pressures. One from within. Because there was an important question. You failed. The message was internally to the system. You failed. You put all your investment in this. Look what they did. And internationally, Europeans are not delivering. Iran said, okay, we don't need America. America will withdraw, that's fine. But Europeans can help. Europeans said, no, sorry, we cannot do more, actually. We are a little bit worried because this may affect our relation with the United States. So again, Europeans, they failed to deliver to Iran, which increased the pressure on the government, on Rouhani's government, and the whole regime. I would say it's not only on Rouhani, because this deal was approved by the establishment. It is not the deal of Rouhani. It's not the deal of Zarif. Zarif and his team were basically is the soldiers who are implementing what we agreed on. But it's the decision of the establishment to move on and to sign the deal with 5+1. So now, after all of this, they came to the point where, okay, there is change in the White House. Biden came with a promise that he will to go back. But on what basis he can't go back? Trump created load of obstacles. He destroyed all roads to build peace with Iran. He creates more doubts about American politics and how can you trust American politicians. So the first task Biden has to deal is actually to say, I am trustworthy. You can work with me. Maybe he didn't say it, but I think others say that he's a third presidency of Barack Obama. So basically he was saying, I'm a trustworthy man, you can work with me. And this also was not enough. He wanted to convince the European to work. The European were saying to him, look what your former president did. Guys, you need to be serious, because you are putting us you're throwing under the bus as Europeans, and then you escape. So you need to be serious on how to handle the whole issue. And more important, basically, is the issue of buying times. Biden in the office in January, the presidency of Iran is 18th of June. There was a Nowruz, there is Ramadan. The American administration is not really, pushing to the deal. They are buying times because they want to see the new president. Iran wants something to happen before 18th of June. This may help the regime to gain more legitimacy, which will be reflected on the percentage of the participation in the election on the June 18th. So this is not happening at all. Iran is pushing. The Americans are taking their time, and I think there is something expected to happen today in direct talk between Washington and Tehran in Vienna. If this works, maybe a change may happen on the whole story. Now, where is the region from this? In recent months, after Biden came to the White House, we know that the region was worried about the deal because they were basically not consulted. And that is basically, it's normal, because when did the United States actually coordinate with the regional players? I mean, I don't know serious stories about this. Americans, they look at their interests, and they did this with Turkey, and they did Israel, and they did this with Iran. Maybe there's an assumption that they should take us seriously. Americans did not. Barack Obama did not, and Biden, he did not promise. Europeans, and in particular the president of France, he was the person who said, we need to engage Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states in a future negotiation with Iran. Of course, any debate about engaging the region, this needs approval from all 5+1 and also Iran. And the important question, what is the nature of engagement? Are they attending the meetings and just listening to what's happening, or they have something to deliver, or to promise, or to help in this negotiation? Iran, from the first second, said, no, this is between us and you, 5+1. We don't need anything. This means in the region, more worrying about where things are heading. Of course, one can say Gulf states are not, they are not one voice. I agree with that. I have said that since 2002. Gulf states, they have 6 different voices. And what GCC basically just yesterday released that they want to be engaged on this. I'm not sure actually how many of the states they actually approved it, that statement. Because we know that Qatar has an open line with Iran, and it was obvious. I mean, just the last 24 hours when Natanz was targeted, the important phone call took place between Rouhani and Sheikh Tamim. So this tells you there is an open line, or a serious communication between Doha and Tehran. And also, Oman has also kept its line with Tehran as well. Emiratis, they have an issue with Iran, which is the normalization with Israel. There is serious concern of that, but at the same time, they open the door. They left the door open with Tehran, and try to not to be really an enemy to Iran. And Iran also tries not to be to open the door of confrontation with Abu Dhabi. Remain Kuwait and Bahrain, I'm not sure what role they can do. However, it's important to look at the real regional concern does exist on where things are heading. What Iran will be given, and if the whole talk restarted, and what is the beneficial to what about the benefits to Iran economically and politically? What about its regional role? Are the United States willing to discuss what's happening in Yemen, in Iraq, in Lebanon, all of this. My assessment, there is no indication that Washington ready to focus on this. I think Biden wants.
Okay, you seem to be cutting out.
1 minute?
Yes, please go ahead. 1 minute.
The elephant in the room is Israel. Israel actually is looking at all of this and insisting on one thing, that do whatever you want in politics, negotiation. However, Israel will continue targeting Iran. And I think Iran between two choices, saving face or saving the head. And I think I will give more explanation on this on the questions. Thank you.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you so much. Amazing coverage of perspectives in the region. Again, let's save our questions to the last and move on to our next speaker, our panelist. Andreas, please, you have the virtual floor.
Thank you very much, Shahram and Anoush, for inviting me. I kind of echo much of what Mahjoob said already about the context. I don't want to dive too much into this because fear of being repetitive. But let me again look at more in depth at three GCC countries that I think matter most when it comes to this, and that's Qatar, UAE, and Saudi Arabia, and the way they look at it. And obviously, the context of the JCPoA is an entirely different one than it might be for us in the West, and it's also a different one to what it is to Israel. So, if we look at starting with Saudi Arabia in particular, as the kind of counterweight to the Iranians. The Saudis from all the GCC countries are most fearful and are most somewhat exposed to Iran's activities in the region. And obviously, similar to other Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia is looking at Iran and Iran's activities way beyond the actual nuclear issue. I think for the GCC countries, the nuclear issue is important, but it's not that important. And we shouldn't forget that Iran and Saudi Arabia are already at war with one another. And, I would call it a surrogate war, where Saudi Arabia is very much losing at the moment. And while Israel, for example, equally involved in a surrogate war in the gray zone, so to speak, with Iran, it seems to be at least keeping the balance. So the situation is an entirely different one. The problem that Saudi has, similar to other Gulf countries, is that they don't trust Washington, they don't trust the US administration. And as Mahjoob already said, the issue with that is obviously, can Biden actually show that he is a trustworthy candidate? Can he bring something en route that will survive not just his presidency, but potentially a change of government in 4 years or in 8 years' time? And that is kind of the volatility from Washington is a very important one. And beyond that, we shouldn't also not just focus on the United States, because they're one part to this JCPoA. China and Russia and the EU are also part of that conflict, part of that agreement. So looking at the kingdom and the way they look at the JCPoA, they want an extension of the JCPoA, not just looking at the nuclear issue, but looking more widely at Iran's activities across the region. And that is because obviously Saudi Arabia is being directly targeted by Iran through Yemen. It has been targeted through Iraq and also been directly targeted from Iranian territory over the last couple of years. And it's obviously has created a security situation that for the Saudis is no longer tenable. So at the previous round of talks that led to the JCPoA initially, I would say that Saudi Arabia was a lot more secure than Saudi Arabia is today. And obviously much of it is to its own doing. Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen has obviously exacerbated the security situation, very much to their own doing. And the Iranians have exploited it wherever they could. And this idea of a war of delegation, the way that Iran is trying to secure itself through delegation of defense to external parties outside their borders, kind of pushing something that Anicée was already talking about, the kind of creating this kind of umbrella around, or this kind of cordon around Iran, where surrogates fight on their behalf to kind of keep the fire and keep the war away from Iranian territory, has been very successful. And it has created a sort of stability that the Iranians can live with. Obviously, it hasn't created stability in the way that we would in the West look at stability, but it's a sort of stability that Iran can actually live with and is happy to live with. And MBS, obviously, as the Crown Prince and previous defense minister and serving defense minister as well, obviously his failure is the war in Yemen, but his failure more than that is of saying that he came into power saying, I will secure you from Iran, I will make Saudi Arabia great again. And on the contrary, all these activities that Iran has been able to kind of drive around in the region have exacerbated the security of Saudi Arabia, and thereby he's kind of running the risk of losing face, and has already lost face in many ways. So for Saudi Arabia, a JCPoA can ever only be acceptable if it comes with a security guarantee to its own borders and its own territory. And I think, you know, there is a slim hope that if there was a serious a serious initiative by the Americans, by those parties concerned with the JCPoA, to build up something that goes beyond the nuclear issue, building something that is a security environment, a security framework that involves Iran and involves the GCC, I think that Saudi Arabia would, albeit reluctantly, sign on to this. At the moment, there's nothing to be seen. The problem is the region doesn't have a security framework whatsoever. The GCC had some security framework, which kind of fell apart in 2017, so no longer exists. The common threat perception of Iran is obviously varying across members of the GCC and also across members of the Arab League, which again obviously undermines the building up or setting up of a common security framework. But the JCPoA, what it needs to do moving forward is, for Saudi Arabia, is exactly doing that, is kind of creating something that goes beyond the nuclear issue and provides security. While for the Israelis, Iran's activities in the region might be second or third in terms of on the priority list. The Israelis are a lot more involved and a lot more concerned about nuclear capability and obviously missile capability. The Saudis are very much concerned obviously about missile capability of Iran as well, but also beyond that, their indirect surrogate warfare across the region. So a JCPoA+++ has to address this as well. And that is kind of the key issue, because everything we're looking at, everything we've been talking about so far has been about the nuclear issue, and there seems to be some avenue to make some progress in that direction. But with the radicalization going on inside Iran, and with the elections probably bringing out someone who might be more hardliner, taking more hardline approach than Rouhani, it's very unlikely that Iran is going to make any concessions on other aspects of security, whether it's the ballistic missile systems or obviously its other activities, which Iran obviously denies. Another thing that Saudi wants, they want to sit at the table. They want to be part of it. It seems like the talks that are going on in Vienna at the moment, looks like some of the GCC countries have sent delegations as well to kind of pressure and lobby, make sure that some of their concerns are being implemented. Although I do think that Washington at this point, is not really listening to what the GCC has to say about this, and that's, I think, why this is going to fail eventually, because Biden will not be able to kind of buy trust into the new process. And obviously the war in Yemen has to be brought to an end, and the Saudis understand this. The Saudis really want to get out of the war. It's a war they created. It's a mess they created, and it's been run by a surrogate that, the Houthis, which are obviously a self-sustaining entity, which obviously take Iranian support, but are not necessarily dependent on Iranian support. And even if Iran decided to kind of withdraw their support, the Houthis would continue fighting, which obviously makes this very problematic, because this entire surrogate war has been one where it's been delegated, people have been activated, groups have been activated by Iran, but Iran doesn't necessarily have all that control over these groups, and thereby have created these kind of non-state actors that are very, very difficult to actually put back under control. And that is and remains and will remain a security concern for the Saudis. If we look at Qatar, obviously Qatar takes an entirely different approach to this. Qatar has never really looked at Iran as a security threat in the same way that the Saudis have. Quite on the contrary, I mean, Qatar's security considerations have always been more focused on its neighbors, because that's where the more tangible threats were coming from. And obviously because there is a sort of, relationship there between Qatar and Iran that dates back, until the early 1990s. Where on security issues as well, there is dialogue happening, and deconfliction has always happened, and we've never seen any real tensions in Qatar that kind of could be traced back to Iran in the same way that they could have been traced back to some of their other neighbors. The Qataris very much believe in a pragmatic approach to Iran. They say we're part of the same neighborhood. We kind of share the same maritime border. We share the same gas fields. So we need to make sure that this will continue, and this, there's more that unites us and kind of ties our interests together than what kind of takes us apart. There's another aspect of this, though, and I think Hamad bin Jassim said this, former Prime Minister of Qatar, a while back. He said, we lie to them and they lie to us. So there is still a lack of trust, but still, despite all this, the Qataris very much believe that engagement is better than confrontation, and obviously them trying to offer their services as an intermediator or interlocutor, it kind of goes into the same direction. And so the JCPoA for the Qataris is an important milestone. They don't necessarily require a wider JCPoA. They believe the JCPoA could be a starting point to build upon if the Americans are actually serious about it. Start with a nuclear issue and then potentially build up something that is wider than this. The Qataris also responded fairly positive to what Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, once suggested, this idea of hope, having sort of security umbrella, a security framework in place with Iran. Part of it, very much the Qataris would be supportive of this, because also for the Qataris, the GCC as a security umbrella hasn't really provided, obviously throughout the 2017 crisis and beyond. If we look at the UAE as arguably the most powerful country in this region, at the moment, in terms of military power, information power, and also in terms of internal stability. The UAE have always tried a kind of a dual approach towards Iran. They obviously see Iran's activities in the region as highly problematic. Especially Abu Dhabi has very much securitized Iran as Iranian activities in the region as a fundamental threat to their national security, while Dubai on the other side has always taken an approach of engagement through trade and financial services, a lot more business-minded, a lot more pragmatist, and a lot less zero-sum as Abu Dhabi is. Dubai has, obviously pan-Gulf relations are very deep between Iranian families and local families. Dubai remains the most important business hub for Iran in the region outside of Iran. Oil smuggling is still taking place via companies in Dubai and other northern Emirates, despite the fact that Abu Dhabi is trying to clamp down on this. And that all happens at the same time that Abu Dhabi has obviously been lobbying with very much securitized narratives in Washington against Iran, against the JCPoA. So it's kind of approach of a strategy of duality, where Abu Dhabi can always kind of turn up a little bit more pressure through its security-minded narratives, while on the other hand, turning up a bit more of engagement through Dubai when it comes to trade and finances. And that is a kind of a schizophrenic approach that Abu Dhabi has taken, but it has worked. But it's for the Emiratis, it's a very, very very fragile situation to be in. And obviously, if we look at the 2019 attacks on Fujairah of tankers, we saw the tanker attack off the coast a couple of days ago, which was Israeli owned. There's a new security dimension now for the Emiratis that should not be underestimated, particularly now as normalization with Israel has taken place. It seems like UAE is getting pulled into Israeli activities as well. And obviously, Israel has been provided with a lot of access in Abu Dhabi to intelligence sharing, access to security services. And as Abu Dhabi becomes a hub for Israeli activities, at least when it comes to intelligence gathering vis-a-vis Iran, and potentially also using cyber infrastructure in Abu Dhabi against Iran, Abu Dhabi will inevitably become a target for some of the activities. Which should be and is definitely something that is quite concerning, because Israel is obviously pursuing its own activities and doing so with very little regard for what their so-spoken Gulf partners think. And I think there's quite a lot of risk in this, because Israel can, if that kind of standoff in the gray zone that we're seeing at the moment, like I said, we're in this surrogate war. This is not a peaceful engagement. There's not a state. It's not a cold war. It's quite a hot war actually, but it's under the threshold of what we consider an international armed conflict. It's kind of increasing gradually. Salami tactics. The Israelis can deal with more heat. They could even deal with an escalation with Hezbollah, even though this is something they really want to avoid. The Emiratis, as the Saudis, cannot deal with military confrontation. Anything hotter than what we see at the moment is already unacceptable. And if the UAE get drawn into this, any sort of escalation with Iran is going to be a lot more costly for the UAE than it is for Israel. So whatever Israel is doing will inevitably have an impact on Abu Dhabi's security considerations as well. So because they're just not a match. The Emiratis understand they have a very sophisticated military, but they are not a military match to the Iranians. And again, the concern in the UAE is not necessarily about the nuclear program. It is more about more conventional capabilities, most importantly, ballistic missile capabilities, and obviously surrogate operations in the region. Okay, and I'll stop here, and I'm very happy to talk about anything more in depth later on during Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andreas. Thank you for sticking to the time. Again, really important issues you have raised there, especially this whole issue of trying to enhance security, but by default, creating more insecurity for oneself, just because of the tactics that the states use, especially the proxy tactics. Now, I'd like to invite my co-host, Professor Ehteshami, to reflect on the presentation before we go to Q&A. Anoush, are you there?
Shahram. Thank you very much, Shahram. Let me first thank you, Middle East Studies Forum, Deacon, and your team for bringing us together today. For your information, colleagues, we've been planning this for about a month, and yet the timing could not have been more fortuitous given what is going on in the region. This is a moving target, but to land it where we have done is wonderful. And then to have three such impressive speakers who have opened up this Pandora's box for us in such a complex and insightful way is wonderful. So thank you all for your work so far. I'm conscious of time. And before I get to my brief comments and then we go to Q&A, I should also extend my Ramadan greetings to all those who are reflecting on the holy month through fasting, prayer, and reflection. We all hope that you have a happy Ramadan as well. In terms of comments, so much ground was covered by Anicee, Mahjoob, and Andreas that it's difficult to capture all of it. But there are four themes that I'd like to take out, and hopefully colleagues participating will probe these and other issues in the course of our deliberations. And I should add also that we aim to look at the wider spectrum of presentations through further webinars and events that al-Sabah program and the Middle East Studies Forum will forward in due course. The four things, Shahram, that stood out for me were, first, a point that Anicee emphasized, and it recurred also, was this incongruousness of domestic politics in Washington and Tehran, that both countries are hostage to the domestic clock of the political process. This is not the first time this has happened. This is the fourth time that Iran and US have reached a premise and have not been able to make that necessary step forward because of domestic issues. Park this for a moment, because there are, of course, wider implications arising from this. The second issue that comes out very strongly is JCPoA at what cost, and who is going to pay the price for JCPoA. Andreas has drawn attention to regional concerns, as indeed has Mahjoob and Anicee. So in whose interest is JCPoA beyond Tehran and Washington? And what is very clear is that neither Tehran nor Washington are actually focused on this real problem of the need to unlock this puzzle as best they can. The third issue is JCPoA can no longer be addressed in isolation. That is actually not just about Iran's nuclear program any longer. That once Trump left the JCPoA, then all of these other range of issues were inevitably caught up in broader relations with Iran. And now that there are issues with most of Iran's neighbors with its regional policies, it is almost impossible to then have this reductionist approach of saying JCPoA 2.0 is about just this. It clearly isn't. It clearly isn't. And again, it relates to not just the regional issues, but the point that Anicee made very strongly is JCPoA full stop is not sufficient. That the West, particularly the Western participants, cannot avoid or ignore the domestic currents, the middle classes in Iran, that Rouhani bolstered in the interest of a deal with international powers for better life, not just economic, but also political and civil life. It's very difficult now to say those issues no longer matter to us, because again, JCPoA 1.0 raised all these expectations. And finally, fourthly, what I hear over and over again in the presentations and the broader discussions regarding JCPoA is the lack of a regional security framework that does not allow to build first consistency and continuity. Were there a framework in place, the world would not be hostage to domestic politics of Iran and the United States. That there would be other structures and institutions that can move this and other agendas forward. And secondly, within a regional security framework, the wider issues, the concerns of Saudi Arabia and Israel and UAE and other countries indeed have about regional policies of Iran and others, can then be at least raised, if not fully addressed, within that forum. And my final point, for that to work though, we need more than Iran-US. We need the other parties to JCPoA, in particular Russia and China, who now have vested interests in this region, but also European countries who are closely interacting with their GCC partners, have an interest in Iran's prosperity and also in Iraq's security. That a framework of the sort that Russia put forward to the UN a year and a bit ago, for example, can be a really interesting starting point, that Iran's own approach, plus what China is now talking about, can be put into a mix of a broader discussions that can bring the parties together and make the JCPoA a reflection of wider need for regional cooperation rather than an end game in itself. So thank you again, speakers, for your splendid coverage of the issues. And now, Mahmoud Jan, let's get to our participants, please.
So for questions, thank you so much, Anoush. That's amazing. So for questions, please use the Zoom function of raising hands. You can find that by going to the reactions button and find the raise hand function. And then we'll ask you to unmute yourself and pose your question. Please keep your questions succinct and to the point. About 25 minutes, and we need to make sure everyone gets a chance to raise a question. So the floor is open now.
Okay, we have a few people right now, Marzieh, James, and anybody else, please let me know.
Okay, well.
Okay, yes, Hussein. So we start from Marzieh, and we go to James and Hussein.
One by one.
Yes.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for very, very interesting presentations and the sum up. My question is that considering the rise of another wave of COVID in Iran and the increasing, which is like the British version, and the rising number of casualties and its huge impact, is there a possibility that we consider the potential for considering the postponement of presidential elections? which then has an impact on JCPOA negotiations, renewed negotiations. On the one hand, it gives more room to the Rouhani administration and time for them to have better and more enhanced, or even more get the negotiations further. And on the other hand, then the United States needs to consider its approach, and it's like half-hearted approach to the JCPOA. That was my question.
Would I please ask you to introduce yourself and also all other participants? Would you mind?
I'm Dr. Mahjoob Zweiri, Durham University Assistant Professor in International Relations.
Thank you. Okay, anyone from the panel would like to respond to that question?
I'd be happy to go for that one. So Marzia, thank you for your question. I think it is unlikely that they will postpone the elections for one reason, I mean, for several reasons. One of the reasons would be that it could potentially empower one of the future potential candidates, who would be Zarif himself. He has not yet declared himself a candidate, but of course, if he's successful at doing something with the JCPoA otherwise before the election, he's a very able and candidate, even though his popularity has dipped recently in the Islamic Republic of Iran. So that could be a way for him of reworking his popularity and be elected. So that would work only if it's postponed, so he's got a very limited window. Another reason why it would not happen is, again, that first of all, it's never happened in the history of the Islamic Republic of Iran that we have postponed elections, and then because the framework, the constitutional framework is such, and the legal framework is such that it doesn't give that kind of flexibility. So while your solution sounds very reasonable, actually, considering the context, I believe it's unlikely to happen based on constitutional provisions.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I see James next. Can you unmute yourself and lower your hand, James?
Thank you, Shahram. Just following on from what Anicee and Marzia were saying there, actually, Zarif, he keeps saying he's not going to nominate for president until he's actually solved the nuclear issue. Is what he's saying now, but who knows what he'll say in a few weeks' time. But actually, my question is for Anicee and Andreas, and if Mahjoob wants to come in as well, that's also good. It's about the election itself, because I've been following it, and it's very similar to 2013, where they're talking about having a candidate who can be a nuclear negotiator. In 2013, it was Rouhani and Jalili. Jalili was the hardline candidate. He's back again. But now the hardline or principalist candidate, this time around, the principalist, well, it seems to be a lot of the chatter is around a more conservative candidate is more likely to win based on turnout and everything else. And Jalili, having the history in understanding nuclear politics in Iran, would be preferred, but at the same time, the preferred domestic candidate is Raisi. So I just wanted to know if what your thoughts are on the domestic situation in Iran, and whether, because in Iran itself, it seems to be there's lots of issues that people talk about, not just the nuclear issue, but how important is that for an election?
And also, James, would you mind introducing yourself?
Oh, sorry, I'm James Barry from the Alfred Deakin Institute at Deakin University. I'm working with Shahram and Mahmoud at the moment on the Iranian election website, and also we're running a podcast starting next month.
Thank you, James.
Yeah, thank you very much. Look, I'm not in domestic political expert on Iran, but if I look at the candidates that have been flagged or they've been introduced, there's a range of candidates who would be obviously a lot more conservative, and this is there obviously, as you know, there are two aspects of who decides in the end the policy that Iran is going to pursue when it comes to security and defense. And I do think that those who are opposed to the JCPoA, who are opposed to engagement, who've been somewhat disenfranchised or feeling disenfranchised and cheated by the American withdrawal, are those people who are not necessarily running for president, and these are the people who dominate the security sector. And it's these kind of individuals who you need to convince. And when we look at, the issues that I was talking about, ballistic missiles, when we talk about, the range of surrogate operations across the region, those people within the IRGC, within the Quds Force, these kind of individuals are still dominating, and it's regardless of who's going to be elected next president. These people are now firmly more in power and more, taking more action and with more liberty across the region because of maximum pressure and obviously their kind of counter reaction, which is maximum resistance. And I think maximum resistance is going to continue. And you're absolutely right. Obviously, the issues inside of Iran that people are concerned with are obviously, most importantly, I'd say, the socioeconomic impact of sanctions. So again, sanctions and the socioeconomic problems, even COVID relief is somewhat hit by sanctions. Every single aspect and domain of Iranian politics is hit and undermined by the sanctions regime, and the sanction regime is directly a follow-on from the JCPoA. So I do think that it is on people's minds. Someone who can promise a return to some sort of normality, particularly for the lower and middle classes, for those people who are not part of the wider rentier system of the IRGC and the regime, as in the deep state, if you will. I think these kind of people are the ones that need to be, these people as well are those who are feeling the impact of sanctions and thereby indirectly exposed to the consequences of the JCPoA. So, and despite this, whoever gets elected in on whatever ticket that might be, and I don't think it's going to be someone as moderate as Rouhani, I think they will face an uphill battle. If they're not from the conservative heartland spectrum themselves, will face an uphill battle against individuals who will continue activities across the region because they've always done so. It's part of the fabric of security and defense of the Islamic Republic. And I think this will continue across the region, whether it's in Lebanon or in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and obviously in the maritime domain increasingly. And they're quite good at it. This is where Iran has a competitive edge militarily and in terms of security. Overall, its competitors in the Gulf, but also competitors in the wider Arab world. So why would they stop? And I think that remains to be, despite the outcome, whatever the outcome is going to be, this will remain one of the key pressure points. And I think the empowerment of these radical elements is not only reflected in the political domain, but in the domain of the security state that is being built. I think the Islamic Republic over the last 5 or 6 years has become more an autocratic, a military dictatorship, which is slightly different, exists in parallel to what we've seen in the political domain. Because, and I'm saying this, looking at all these military dictatorships in the Arab world, obviously, where the security sector has disproportionate leverage over day-to-day politics and obviously international relations. And that is going to and will remain a key challenge to anything that will be negotiated even after the elections.
Okay, we're moving on.
Anissa, I think, was coming in.
Go ahead.
Sorry,
Anissa.
yeah. I've just got a bit of a different perspective, perhaps. Okay. First of all, James, I completely agree with your comment that it's very much 2013-like in terms of the candidate and the options. But I think that something that is really on the mind of the Iranians right now that we didn't have in 2013 is the pandemic. Iranians are not talking about the JCPoA right now. The press is, Iranians are not, and they're not that much talking about everything that's security and defense. They are obsessed with the vaccine, absolutely obsessed with getting their shot. Everyone you speak to is talking about this. And the next topic of interest is human rights, because there've been a lot of arrests, especially educated women. So those are two major points of discussion. And it is not the first time that we're having this discrepancy in Iranian politics. We have, on the one hand, the population being focused on daily life. And on the one hand, the candidates that are more engaging, thinking that the JCPoA will change everything politically. So I think this dichotomy is very much of interest. And I would just like to conclude by saying that the Iranian people are very resilient, as you all know. We have been through so much already, from earthquakes, war, and now the pandemic, that the JCPoA and the sanctions we have adapted. Everyone that I speak to has adapted to the fact that sometimes you cannot find tomatoes or chicken, but the vaccine, that is another story.
Thank you.
Can I say something on the
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, let me just shed a little bit of light on how I see the elections scene. There is an op-ed will come today in London. I wrote about an early assessment of the presidential elections. You know, this election is coming after the previous parliamentary elections with the lowest percentage participation, 42%. And this is a real nightmare that this election will be the same, or maybe less participation we will see in this election, take into consideration the failure of handling the epidemic and also the failure of handling the consequence of the maximum pressure of Donald Trump. So I think you know, there was a survey done and published in Tehran Times, which indicated, and the title was, you know, the 13th presidential election will witness I think the highest percentage of participation. It was obvious that it was used for you know, internal use and internally, but if you dig down and then look at you know, how the mood in Tehran from what's been written and what's been said, I think there is a serious concern within the establishment about how many of the Iranians will vote in these elections. And based on that, which kind of candidates we want to allow to run for the elections. This election will not be like previous election between reformists and conservatives. This will be between a conservative who was a little bit technocrat, or as someone who's coming with a military background. It is within the same circle, and that is something may lead to see more struggle within the voter. So who to choose? Someone who comes from Revolutionary Guard, and we know what those people are doing, or someone actually who's conservative, but maybe he's a little bit, you know, he can maneuver. But again, he's from the circle. So we have to keep eye on these two issues. The percentage of participation, this is a real concern. The regime always wants this election to renew the legitimacy. This is something in their mind. This is something they wanted that in the last 40 years. So I think we have to look at in the remaining 100 days of, you know, until the elections, to see, you know, who will be coming and how many technocrats will be coming. I don't think so Zarif is someone who can be prepared to tackle the future challenge of Iran as a country. I'm not sure he will be having the blessing of the Supreme Leader or the Expediency Council for different reasons. I think the concern now, who will be, you know, the candidate who convince more voters to come and vote. They don't want 50% like Hassan Rouhani in his first presidency. They wanted percentage like Mohammad Khatami in 1997 when he has election around 78%. That's what they want. That's what the establishment wants. Thank you.
Right. Thanks so much for that. We're moving on to Hossein Durrani. Would you mind introducing yourself, Hossein? Unmute and introduce. You need to unmute.
You're on mute.
Yes, hello.
Okay. Yes, Assalamu alaikum. Yeah, my name is Hossein Durrani. writer and a political analyst. Just my question is to Dr. Anis. Okay, how do you see the relationship or the negotiation between the Islamic Republic of Iran and Saudi Arabia? As we all know that the Islamic Republic of Iran always extended the friendship and Islamic, Islamic Brotherhood to Saudi Arabia, but the main ruler of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, he on many interviews said that he can see Iran is the main enemy. So how could that be worked out? And second thing, that Saudi Arabia is always clap the hands when Israel attack Iran. They can see it that it's their it's their job, because they can't do it, and when Israel do it, they clap their hands. So how can you see? I had your presentation that it should be a negotiation between Islamic Republic of Iran and Saudi Arabia. Thank you.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thank you. Thank you for challenging me on this. Sorry, Shahram, you want to say something?
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just want to come back first to something that Mahjoob has been saying, which is that it's the first time I'm actually hearing people who are ready to vote for someone who from the Guardian of the Revolution, for the reason that the Besieged and the Guardians have handled the pandemic best than civilian authorities, and I had never heard that before. So I think that's the one to support him. Thank you very much, Hussein, for challenging me on this, because it gives me the opportunity to expand a little bit. Here, I'm going to come back to some of the point that Andreas has made actually in terms of Yemen, and the fact that Saudi Arabia is exhausted by the war in Yemen, and that the Iranians are actually quite concerned by the fact that they don't control the Houthi as much as they thought they did. And that could simply be the baseline, the beginning for a negotiation in terms of what is your interest. As a lawyer, I'm very much aware of the fact that people only function when they have their interest, and states function when they have their interest. So what would be their interest here, and could be the beginning of a dialogue, would be to end this dreadful war in Yemen. Another issue that you've pointed out in your question that's really important is when Saudi Arabia claps their hand, for example, or everything that happened during the summer of 2019, attacking, counter-attacking, which is also calling for a better implementation of international law and a better respect of international law, which Andreas referred to when he said we're not at the threshold of an international armed conflict. And I thought the fact that he was referring to that the legal framework is extremely important. And that's not just for Iran and Saudi Arabia, that's internationally, where politics is taking over the law. So that's in a nutshell my answer. That would be my starting point, but I'm very much aware that, again, this is very rainbow and unicorns.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hussein, you are next. Would you mind if you can turn your video on and unmute and introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Hussein Durrani, a writer and a political analyst.
Thank you so much, Hussein. Now we're moving on to the next Hussein. We have two Husseins.
Yeah. It's HP.
All right.
Go ahead.
You have my voice?
Yes, we have your voice and we have your video. Go ahead.
Okay, very good evening. My name is Dr. Mohammed Bounaja from Canberra. Allow me to render my appreciation to Professor Shahram Akbarzadeh. I read your books I enjoyed before, and as well as to Dr. Ehteshami, your co-host, highly appreciated, and I join him to greet Ramadan to everybody, the Muslim brothers and sisters, and I hope that you will continue with that. This is a very auspicious occasion considering having this webinar, and I think that the reputation of that would be very beneficial. Concerning what the speakers said, I wanted to just have some comments. The first of all is JCPoA is a great model. The multilateral model can be for the whole region and for the whole world. We have other issues in other places with other countries that JCPoA can be a role model for them, and I think can solve their problems. So if all the countries cooperate in order to keep the JCPoA as a role model for international issues, that would be very beneficial for the whole world. The second one that I wanted to say for the regional cooperation of Iran and what Iran has done was fighting terrorism, that I think that it was missed in the speech of the speakers, because Iran was the pioneer on fighting terrorism, and there is no doubt about that. About the Daesh and ISIS, Iran played a major role on that. And the other thing concerning the Iran initiatives is
sorry to cut you off, Hussein. Is there a question there?
Yes, I will come to the question as well.
Please.
Concerning the Hormuz peace initiatives, I think that it could be mentioned. One thing that mentioned was about the fatwa or the decree of the supreme leader, by the Anis, I think. It was about the use. It is not about the use, it's about the production. I put actually the website of the supreme leader of Iran as well here. So I think that this misunderstanding should be clarified, because it is not about the use, it is about the production. It has the production is haram and forbidden. I put it there. It is exactly in the website of the supreme leader as well. And about the vaccine that was mentioned, Iran has produced some 3 vaccines, but it is not actually rolled out, and it is going to come that. And I think that if the money that has been freezed in the South Korea that was supposed to be bought for the vaccine, it could help as well. So the question is that the role of Iran in the region should come as a package in a very pragmatic and holistic matter. It is not actually the missiles, it is not actually the military power, it is the initiatives as well. And Barjam, or what we say JCPoA, is a help for whole region, can save it. The question is that, how we should connect the JCPoA with other initiatives in order this constructive role would be revealed vividly.
Yeah. Excellent question.
Who would like to take that question from the panel?
Oh, I'm happy to go first. I mean, I already touched upon the Hope initiative. Taking the Strait of Hormuz as a kind of common integrator for a dialogue between Iran and the GCC countries in particular. I do think that there could be something under the wide umbrella of talks and engagement over the JCPoA, saying that this is a milestone, but not the only one. To build on this, I think that you could have, we should at least, let's put it that way, we should, and when I say we, the EU in particular, and also the United States, should foster something which is more of a self-supportive, self-sustaining initiative for Arab states as well as Iran to start having a dialogue based on security. I mean, if we look at the ISIS initiative to fight ISIS, Iran was obviously not part of it, despite the fact that obviously the Americans very much relied upon the HH Sheikh in Iraq in some instances to kind of take ground. But this was an initiative that brought together quite a broad coalition. Because we all and that kind of brought everyone together, saying, nobody wants to have an ISIS on the ground. I'm not saying we need ISIS, but we need to have some common integrator, a common threat perception that could build a framework where, and again, going back to Anicee's point, where you have mechanisms of conflict resolution, which are based on law, on arbitration, and on certain norms and principles that are being constantly violated at the moment, including those principles that, part of the UN Charter and whatnot. And I think an initiative, and I think the Iranians are willing to actually engage in it. The problem is if Iran does so half-heartedly in a dual approach, saying we're engaging here and we're committing to this framework, while under the table we're continuing with these destabilizing operations, then obviously that's not going to work. But at least have a starting point for engagement. And I think Oman, Qatar, Kuwait might actually be interested in entering any such framework. And as I said, even the Emiratis might be down the line, if there's pressure from the US, might be willing to join such an initiative. Obviously, bringing Israel in at the moment, where again, Israel, we've seen massive radicalization of politics as well, I think is unlikely. Having Saudi part of this directly, also unlikely. But at least you need to start somewhere. I do think there is a moment, there's a window when, particularly if things flare up again in the Gulf, if we have another tanker war of something that we've seen already in 2019, the threat perception immediately in all Gulf countries and all Gulf capitals was hairs on fire. Oh my God, we have another third world war. If that perception comes in again, I think a remedy to this sort of threat perception would be saying, look, this is the end of it. Let's sit down and discuss. I think there is a window of opportunity.
Thank you. I am mindful of the time. We only have a few minutes left. We do have two people up with questions, Hanley and Nasser. Can you keep your questions very brief? The two of you can we just hear from both of you very briefly, please.
Yeah, sure, I can. Sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot, everybody. And I'm just wondering to get your thought on the urgency of getting an agreement between two parties. Which party do you think that are more in more need of getting an agreement sooner? Because I mean, for the EU and the US, it's very obvious that Iran is putting pressure on by announcing like 60% enrichment and this sort of things. But on Iran, there's sanctions which they want to be lifted as soon as possible. But at the same time, I think another element that you partly discussed about the election, forthcoming election, is that particularly Supreme Leader doesn't want the deal or negotiation to be a part of the election inside Iran, as it was the case in 2013. So do you think that this urgency will push Iran to get an agreement as soon as possible because not to have that topic in the election?
And then Hanley, if you don't mind quickly, your question.
Thank you very much to everybody. Hanley, I'm a research fellow at Victoria University of Wellington. And to keep it short, progress on the JCPoA, what will the effect of this be on Iranian support in Syria, both for the Syrian government, military support, and perhaps even the longer term movement of people in Syria? Thank you.
Thank you, Hanley. And Hossein, you seem to have fallen through the cracks. Would you like to ask a question briefly?
Yes, thank you very much. I have a question from Mr. Mahjoob that with the escalating of Israel against attack against Iran, Islamic Republic of Iran has two choices. He said that keeping face and keeping head. Could you explain more about that, about the keeping face and keeping head?
Thank you. Mahjoob, floor is yours.
Excellent.
Thank you so much. I think Iran is facing one of them, I think, a very critical time when it comes to the confrontation with Israel. In 2020, started with the killing of Qasem Soleimani, and the end of the year with Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, and then 3 attacks on Natanz, which is it's significant when it comes to centrifuges and enrichment, and all of this happened. Israel is not far away from all of this, and Iran always said, we have done everything, and we are sure about our security measures. So all of this happened basically, and which pushed Shamkhani to say yesterday that there is a security hole. Otherwise, these things will never happen in Iran, and which was a very strong statement. I was expecting someone like Shamkhani when he was. I think he was tough on how he described the situation. I think Iran, when I say this, saving the face is, what can they do so they can convince the public, the Iranians inside, that they are defending the nuclear program, which cost Iran politically and economically huge cost. And that is saving the face. What the regime can do, so they say, okay, actually, I was able to protect, Natanz. I was able. There is nothing. And I think saving the face is a real challenge, or saving the head, which basically, if Iran want to respond and say, okay, we need to attack Israel, whether inside Israel or outside, because yesterday there was a statement from Tehran that if we want to target Israel, we will do it inside Israel. So that's okay. That's something a new tactic. So when this will happen, and what will be the cost internationally? What will be the reaction from international community? There will be more political pressure, and then the whole regime will be, under severe pressure. So how can they move between saving face in front of their own people and saving head, I mean the regime, in front of international community? And that is a real battle to the regime. Let me also comment quickly on the point raised about what's happening in Israel, and Syria in particular. Syria is another platform for confrontation between Israel and Iran. Israelis have targeted Iran more than 58 times in Syria. Few of them are basically announced or released by Israelis. Others, no one actually, just from different reports, we were able to collect all of those separately in the last 6 months. And all of those attacks, Iran did not say actually we were attacked. Different statements, very vague statements. Why? Because Iran does not want to say they are involved militarily in Syria. They don't want to say actually we have troops on the ground. But in reality, there is a real round of confrontation happens in Syria. And I think with this pressure on Iran, Syria will become costly to Iran. Syria will become very costly, economically, militarily. And now it seems that very little is being presented in recent 2 years to Syria, comparing with the 50 or 60 million presented between 2012 and 2017. So it seems there is a real impact on Syria and an Iranian intervention in Syria. Final comment, the ongoing confrontation between Israel and Iran, this is an indicator that Israeli security conclusion that they will never trust the political path and the discussion and the negotiation. They will move on targeting a nuclear program of Iran according to their own plan to weaken that and to make sure that it will not threaten Israeli security in any time.
Mahjoob, would you like to say a few words about the question on the urgency of JCPoA before the election?
Oh, that's important. Oh, thank you, Shahram Jan. Thank you so much. Yes, I think the Iranian establishment wants to have something before the elections. By doing so, you will have presenting something to the public, so it may encourage them to vote. That was the strategy of Hassan Rouhani in his second presidency when he was trying to be more diplomatic with the West. Of course, things did not work well. And now I think there is attempt to push, and let's not forget the statement made by Zarif in one of his interviews when he said the West and the United States should be worried of what will be the outcome of the election in June 2021. And he was saying, guys, deal with us, do something with us better than no one knows what will happen in June. I think there is a calculation. Anything will be provided to Iran now will be helpful to increase the percentage of participation which serve the interest of the establishment and the regime for long term.
Thank you.
Okay.
Very quickly, because Anoush has something to say.
Okay, I just
No, I don't. I'd much rather hear my colleagues. Go ahead, Anicee.
Okay, I just want to apologize for drinking water earlier on. I wanted to apologize to my brothers and my sisters. It's simply I have a migraine, so when I have migraines, I need to drink. Okay, it was no disrespect to you.
That's okay. Thank you.
Very thoughtful of you, Anicee. I assume there are no further issues. Andreas, you want to say anything before we wrap up?
I just wanted to respond to the comment about Syria and what this might mean for Iran in Syria. And very quickly, I mean, Iran is very much on the back foot in Syria. Obviously, it relies on the infrastructure, but the regime is not as much reliant on Iran as it used to be. Plus, pressure is mounting from Turkey because Turkey has somewhat obviously severed relations with Iran. In the same way, the Russians now part of this kind of triangular engagement with Qatar and Turkey are also taking almost an opposing view to Iranian engagement. So Iran is no longer as important as it might have been in the earlier stages of the civil war. But what can be said is that the Americans are turning increasingly a blind eye to what Iran has been doing and continues to be doing in in Syria when it comes to certain Syrian Hashd al-Shaabi that are being supported and not only supported, some of them are even run by Quds Force operatives and also Shias from Afghanistan who are being brought in as mercenaries by Iran. All this has been already under the Obama administration something where particularly certain key advisors to the Obama administration turned a blind eye to, because they didn't want to kind of undermine the progress made in negotiations. So I feel that with the same team now in place for Biden, particularly with Robert Malley, I think that some of them will turn a blind eye to some of the activities that Iran is doing in the region, just because they are very, very scared to kind of undermine any progress that of the entirely nuclear-centric talks that they've been leading.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Shahram and Mahmoud, I'm assuming that we are wrapping up. I'm conscious that it's getting quite late in your part of the world, and you have suffered long enough into the night. I have immensely enjoyed our webinar and have learned a great deal from our three speakers, all of whom have been exceptionally insightful, and their analysis outstanding. So thank you, Mahjoob, Andreas, and Anicee, for agreeing to join us for this webinar. As I said at the outset, Shahram and I are plotting other ones, and the theme, Shahram, that keeps coming back to me is the need for a framework not to resolve issues, but to actually begin to discuss issues. And you know, the Russians, if you look at the Russian proposal that went to the UN Security Council, it is kind of mirroring the Helsinki process, which is, to most of you, ancient history. Helsinki was very important in stabilizing the Cold War, and actually facilitated democratization in the medium term in much of Europe. We got close to that following the Kuwait War of 1990-1991, where there were discussions in Madrid and other places about regional dialogue that led to the Oslo process and autonomy in some of the Palestinian territories in 1993, and then peace treaty between Jordan and Israel, which followed. I think we are now in a position where the region and the international community as well. It was Andreas who said there is no appetite for external involvement in the region anymore, which Mahjoob had also highlighted. That given that the international community is now divided, if not polarized, on so many other global issues, given that Afghanistan is about to go pear-shaped again at the end of summer, and given the continuity insecurities in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, the economic crisis that is now affecting the region from Tunisia all the way to Oman, this region needs to wake up and begin to take responsibility for itself. And it can only do so, as again our speakers have emphasized, through a conversation amongst all the parties involved. I think isolation of any country, which includes Israel, is foolhardy in this context. The region needs to look at itself. The leaders need to look at themselves and learn lessons from all the opportunities that have been missed so far. The second point I would like to end on is our panelists, Shahram, recognize the urgency of the need for a new JCPoA, but at the same time, each and every one of them identified all the obstacles that stand in the way of a new JCPoA. And I worry about this because they are reflecting very much the position of the key decision makers in this cycle. And what they're telling us is that none of them have got their eye on the real prize, which is to stabilize the region in the interest of its people. And if there is anything we can take away from this, is the need to emphasize that politics is not just about regimes and elites, it's actually about people. And that the outside world needs to take responsibility for ensuring that regional dialogues are reflective of the aspirations, the needs of the people of the region who have suffered for long enough. And I would like us to, offline, and we'll let everybody know, to begin to think about what might a regional security framework, a regional human security framework look like that would help the region, but also the outsiders, to come to grips with the complex crises which are now gripping this region?
Thank you so much. And I think on that note, we will say good night, good day, good afternoon to everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you. Thank you for joining.
Thank you
See you
very
all
much.
again soon.
Thank
Thank
you so
you.
much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.